Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Caribbean Development Bank's post-annual meeting press conference. I am Camille Taylor, and I'm Head of Corporate Communications at the CDB. I literally have the task of introducing a gentleman who needs no introduction, who is Dr. Gene Leon, the newly installed president of the Caribbean Development Bank. Dr. Leon has been in the hot seat for about 2 months now, and he is actually quite eager to begin his direct one-on-one engagement with the region's media. Over the past 3 weeks, we have said a lot as the events and activities of our annual meeting have unfolded. We said at the beginning that this really was the start of our dialogue, or of a new and fresh dialogue between the CDB and the region. We outlined many things, expressed many ideas, and now it's your turn to seek clarification, ask us questions, and let us elaborate on the matters that we have put on the table over the last 3 weeks. Dr. Leon speaks a lot of partnerships, and a significant partner for us is going to be the region's media. We will need you to get the word out to the people of the Caribbean about what is necessary for development and growth and cohesion going forward. So without saying too much more, I'm going to open the floor for your questions. So we're in the virtual space, so let me welcome those of you joining us directly on the UE TV Zoom platform. Let me welcome those of you joining us on our social media spaces as well. You can ask questions by using the chat feature on Facebook or on YouTube, or you can ask questions by raising your hand on the Zoom platform. We will acknowledge you and ask you to turn on your camera, and then you can pose your question, and then the conversation can begin. So I will start by asking Claire Sheffick of BBI Beacon to pose her question. Claire? Claire, your microphone is muted. Okay, I am not hearing from Claire, so can I ask News Talk Radio Guyana 103 if you would like to pose a question?
I, with your permission, would probably like to bring forward one of my questions that I have scheduled for the one-on-one interview with the president of the CDB, and that is to ask what role does he see, or the bank sees, Guyana's emerging oil and gas economy playing in the regional economy, and how will this assist in overall regional economic recovery and sustainability?
President?
Thank you for the question. If I understand you well, you want to first find out our view on the role the oil sector in Guyana would play. I think we can look at this first from the viewpoint of Guyana. The most visible impact the most visible impact will clearly be in terms of the production of oil. Production of oil will have a natural impact on the output or the GDP of the country.
Okay, President, we are having a technical challenge with your microphone.
It's not green, it's red.
I believe it's on now.
No, it's not. It doesn't have a... It starts red and it goes off. Can I use that one? That's red as well.
Okay, President, I'll give you my microphone.
This one is green. Perfect. So I was making the point that if I understood the question correctly, you wanted to know the impact, how the bank sees it, of the oil in Guyana. And the first aspect of this has to be Guyana would be mining oil, and therefore you would be having an increase in your output, naturally from mining and quarrying, which will lead to clearly at least a contribution to growth. The second aspect of that is the revenues that would accrue to the government from this. So it would be a natural boost to the fiscal situation of the country. And the third aspect of it is because you would be exporting, you're clearly going to have more export receipts that would go into the mix. So from the perspective of the external side, the fiscal side, and GDP growth side, these are all positive elements that one can see as occurring purely from the perspective of Guyana. But that's one side of the coin. The other side of it, of course, is what do you do with this additional income or additional export receipts that you have? And it is there that we need to be clearly cautious. One, oil, of course, is a depletable resource. And so we need to think of it as something that you have, that you are using and using slowly over time. And therefore, we must keep an eye on either when it is about to run out or an eye on the pace at which you are using it. And therefore, how are you using the funds that you will actually obtain from the increased oil production that you have. And there, that is where at least the experience of other oil producers probably comes in very helpful for Guyana. Do you put some of this aside for future generations, or do you use it now to accelerate your development? And if you do you use it in current consumption or for capital projects in infrastructure that can itself generate additional income? So you can look at it from that perspective. It can be used to pay down debt if you so wish, or accumulate resources, or provide reserves for your central bank. But in the end, I think the key point here is these are all linked. And it is the combination of prudent use of those resources to support the overall economic development of the country is where we should see how positive or how impactful the use of those oil resources are going to be. Now, in terms of the region, clearly there are two elements. To the extent that Guyana is part of the region's economy, if Guyana's economy grows, then it is equally a contribution to the economy of the region. So an increase in growth of Guyana will definitely spill over into an increase in growth for the region as a whole. Just maybe to anchor this a little more, I think last year Guyana was maybe the only country that grew by some 40-odd% growth. All the others were negative. To the extent that Guyana grew by 40%, when you put the numbers together, Guyana would have made a very large contribution to the growth rate of the region as a whole. Or put it otherwise, if Guyana did not grow, didn't have the oil, the countries in the region would be seen as actually growing much, much less. At the same time, the other dimension of this is how much does Guyana trade with the rest of the region? To the extent that Guyana trades, Guyana buys, then clearly if Guyana is doing well, whether it's from oil resources or otherwise, then of course that means that the other countries will actually benefit from this increased trade from Guyana. So that would be a positive spillover that one can actually obtain from this. Now we can even think of negative spillovers where the benefits to the Guyanese community may very well now generate disparities in terms of relative income levels between Guyanese with their new oil found wealth versus those that depend on other elements in terms of their contributions to growth. So I don't think that's a straight good, bad answer. I think the potential for it to be good is there, but clearly it would depend on how those, as I said, resources are used and deployed as a means of advancing Guyana going forward.
So, President, another question says, you mentioned the disproportionate economic impact of COVID-19 on women. Does CDB have plans on stream or a planned approach for gender initiatives or projects that will help make up for the lost economic ground?
Thanks for the question. I think we should distinguish outcomes from policies. First, the outcome of COVID having a disproportionately large or significant impact on females is a consequence of the characteristics of female participation, wage inequalities, or just gender inequities that exist in our societies, whether it means that they were in service-oriented industries that stopped or went on the lockdown, or that they ended up working from home and receive even less pay for more work at home than otherwise, or that they initially received less income, so wage discrimination, and because of that means their savings actually fell. These are nothing to do with CDB per se. These are strictly characteristics of the countries where those females work and live. So to the extent that you ask what is CDB doing about it, there is a presumption that CDB would be providing policy instructions to the various governments with regard to how they should enter that space, which is really not what we do. We can surely be encouraging countries to reduce those gender inequities or to promote more gender equality, or for that matter, to provide some additional social protection for the most vulnerable in society, which in this case would include women who would have been more than disproportionately impacted from COVID. And we can encourage the labor reforms or even gender reforms whereby budget items, budget lines, budget spending could even be targeted at providing more for women than they used to in the past. A term normally we talk about gender budgeting. But those elements are there. It is more by way of advice. I think what CDB has done and will continue to do is to simply state the policy line that CDB attaches extremely high importance to promoting gender equality, to reducing gender inequalities, and where we have the opportunity, when we lend or when we provide technical assistance to get countries to adopt reforms that would lead in that direction, then yes, we can encourage and provide that policy advice. But it is not that we ever go into the sovereign space and say that governments must do A, B, C, D, which is what would be required to reverse, as it were, the structural characteristics that were already there before COVID. You know, COVID has only magnified by shining a lens, as it were, on problems that we already had. And I think we should always see that in that light. If we never had the gender disparities that I spoke of at the beginning, then COVID would have hit everyone in exactly the same way. It is because we had those inequities before. That is why COVID has made it even worse. So it's partly, yes, we can encourage, yes, we can promote reforms, yes, we can provide advice, but ultimately the policy action has to come from the sovereign governments where those women or females in general live and reside and work. Yeah.
Thank you, President. Jules Vasquez from 7 News Belize. Please pose your question.
Yes, hello. Good morning. If you could speak about the particularities of the Belize situation. I know you may not be apprised of the most recent statistical data, which was just produced yesterday, but apart from 8% contraction in the economy in the first quarter when compared 2020 to 2021, which is certainly expected, we are dealing with 4 successive quarters of economic contraction. That's number one. And the real question is, a household survey, the results of which were released yesterday, so I'm sure you would not be familiar with it, but it's a poverty assessment survey. And it's the first survey, such survey since 2008, and it shows that 1 in every 2 Belizeans, 52% of the population, is living in poverty. It's an extremely alarming situation, though expected, and that survey was taken in 2018 before COVID. You can imagine that COVID only intensified that downward spiral for many of the poor. And it's a region-wide problem, as you averted in your opening remarks, that COVID has been a catastrophe for our service-oriented region. What are you able to say about the Belize situation and sort of how can we bootstrap ourselves out of this situation where we have, as you know, excessively high debt, a frightening debt to GDP ratio, and now these successive quarters of contraction, and then on top of it, more than half our population in 2018 was living in poverty.
Thank you for the question. Let me begin with a disclaimer. I do not know the statistics. Did we lose you? Oh, okay, you're back. I do not know the statistics from Belize, but let me use what you have just said. If I can paraphrase, you are in recession. You said you had 4 quarters. This last quarter was particularly acute. You have high debt, and you have poverty. And the first point of departure, I don't know, by the way, whether it is a matter of lifting yourself by your bootstraps, but let's freeze the situation where you have it. First thing you're doing is you are looking at this at a point in time. You started off by saying quarter 1 was a 8 or 10% decline versus the previous quarter. But at the same time, you said 2018, they had 50%, 1 in 2, 50% poverty. And so I'd want you to think through just a little what you've just said. 50% poverty means that you had poverty long before COVID. That's the first. COVID, to the extent that it generated the reduction in activity that you said was 8, 10% or 4 quarters into recession, means at least that people's incomes would have gone down, employment would have risen, the poor probably would have less. And let's assume you didn't have any social protection, chances are poverty rates would have gone up, which I think is where you were leading, since the COVID issue. And so the question really is, what can the government do about it? Is, I think, your real question. And it's a follow-on to the point I made previously. We observe things over time, and at the point you are looking at it is always the accumulation of everything that has happened before. The debt issue didn't just happen in COVID. It may have gone up a little, but it didn't happen in COVID. The poverty of 50% that was at the beginning or onset of COVID and rose a little was there before. The concentration or your lack of export competitiveness or the concentration on the services was there before. And so when COVID came, it magnified and made things a little worse. And therefore, what we should be thinking of, and as not to, I don't know what your government has or hasn't done, but what we should be thinking of is first, what was the ameliorative, and I am using ameliorative because it's not to fix, ameliorative options that were used to help lessen the impact of COVID. And I think across the world, and I'm almost certain by that definition, Belize's government would fit in there. Across the world, people have said, let us sustain livelihoods. People who are very poor, vulnerable, they got something. Whether it was cash transfers, they received something. Businesses that had lost out and didn't have any opportunity to continue the business, they were provided some breaks, whether it was deferred taxes or cash contributions to keep them afloat. That happened. The spending in the health sectors to at least provide some means for people who got sick because of COVID being a health issue as well, that was done. And it is in principle because of that increase in spending. Governments didn't have the option of firing people. Because of that increase in spending in the health, reduction in revenues, because of the activity that took place, what you describe as the debt situation actually got worse. And so there is a cost, where I'm going with this is, there's a cost in terms of debt of providing this little, if you want help, ameliorative help to those that were in greatest need. And that's a decision I think all governments did. The second part to this question is, as of today, we still don't know how long the impact of COVID is going to be. So we are faced with another question. Should the government be continuing those very ameliorative processes that they put in place? Or do they stop? And if they stop, what's going to happen? Does that mean people become poor again? Or the businesses go out? Or does that mean the government continues to ratchet up more debt? If the government continues to ratchet up more debt to keep that situation going, then clearly we now have to balance which is the worst evil. Is it the debt that's going up or those people's lives that are being saved? Now, assuming even COVID were to stop, and we started to move on with our lives, then the next part becomes, how do we recover, put the country back again in a form that is reasonable? That will require some spending, will require activity with regard to taxation, but almost certainly, I think I can say this without knowing the Belize case, if the debt situation is so high, it's almost certainly the case that it cannot remain that high. It won't be as sustainable as is what would be needed for anyone to have confidence to be able to lend to the Belizean government. And therefore, you will be in a situation where your debt ratios will remain high. You will have even less money to spend on other things until the country recovers in a reasonable way. Now, even if we recovered, you still have the longer term issues of tackling the very problems that got you to before COVID where you were. How do you address poverty? How do you address not building up that debt? How do you address the infrastructure that Belize needs to put it on a stronger growth path? How do you reverse that temporary negative impact of growth that you had? Again, it will become a trade-off. Do I spend money in infrastructure or do I give people a wage increase? And all of those, I'm sure, are things that your Belizean counterparts are beginning to ask. But in the end, we cannot get away from the bottom line. We can only continue to grow if you can produce quality items, goods or services that people are willing to pay good prices for, that will provide you the means to be able to earn, and you can reinvest it into infrastructure and long-term investments that will allow you to reap that benefits down the road. So every economy, as I see it now, Belize included, needs to be able to see the separation or the transition from rescue efforts to recovery efforts and then to long-term development, growth, sustainability efforts. And it is that interplay that we need to try to understand well, and understand well because there will be trade-offs. You only have a fixed amount of money at any one point in time. You have ideas about how much you might earn in the future. You're going to mortgage what you think you will get in the future to be able to spend today. And I need not tell you, since you're from Belize, the vulnerabilities of hurricanes wiping through, drought wiping through. When this happens and it sets you back another 3 years, guess what? We have another COVID. We just don't call it by the name COVID. Government now has to do the same balancing act again, right? Give some to this person, I have a little less here. And that balancing act, in my mind, calls for an appreciation of the difficulty that governments face on a day-to-day basis. No? Making those choices. I think the bigger issue is a communication problem. Maybe we need to find ways to explain, not just to you, but to Belizeans and to the region as a whole, these trade-offs that need to be made, because typically it means sacrifice. To be able to do something tomorrow, you have to sacrifice something today. And that sacrifice maybe is not communicated adequately enough. And because of that, then we end up, and I want to say, forgive me for picking on you, we end up with slicing the cake, picking out that slice, and say that slice doesn't look good, therefore the cake is bad. As opposed to, maybe if you were luckier, you picked out the slice looked good, and you say, I'm going to have the whole cake. But by the time you get to the end of the cake, you realize it's not as good as you really thought. And it works both ways. We are looking at this now from the vantage point of COVID. But supposing it was on the other foot, and things are looking good, you know what you would do in the same way? You would say, growth is very good, the government is doing good, the country is doing good. Until you realize, well, maybe you should have put some money aside to take care of the buffer when something happens. That's the issue of the cake, looking at the slice without taking a whole look at the entire thing.
Thank you, President. Dennis Chabral at News Talk, you indicated that you had a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. I essentially wanted to ask the President in a follow-up, to what extent does he envisage Guyana, with more oil revenues and higher growth, playing a major role in lending bilaterally or through the CDB to sister CARICOM member states whose economies are not performing well, for instance, those that are tourism dependent, we all know what they're going through. And the background or the context of my question is when Trinidad and Tobago was in fact doing well in the 70s and 80s with their oil industry, we had seen them play a major role in assisting countries like Guyana financially.
Yeah, I don't know if I am in a position to opine or guess government policy, but let's think about it this way. One is, even if we are saying Guyana is going to be producing oil, it is a combination of how much they produce and the price of oil that will matter. Oil prices are notoriously volatile. They can move from super high to super low at a flash, within a month, within a week. And personally, I would imagine the government would be aware of that. And as a very minimum, even if they were conservative, what they would want to be able to ensure is that they have a steady stream of income to meet their needs. And as with anybody who saves or who has more investable resources than they use, they have to make a decision as to how they intend to save it. Do they want to save it at home? Do they want to save it by investing it overseas? And overseas there could very well mean within the region. But that puts you in a slightly different space. Does Guyana want to invest more, meaning more than their shareholder stake at CDB, by providing some funds, some resources for regional use? That can be a decision the government may entertain, or they may want to simply lend bilaterally, or they may want to find ways of providing some sorts of concessional financing. But as you'd appreciate, I mean, this clearly is not within the space of CDB. I'm only trying to fill some space here for you by giving you possible options, but really it is not a question I think we can answer. That is really government policy.
Thank you, President. Now, you mentioned plans for CDB to become a data hub. Can you expand on what that would look like and how soon we can look forward to that?
Well, the data hub is not something that can happen overnight. And in fact, it will be a live instrument that will continue to evolve. What I would probably want to do is to say, what are we thinking about? And that can maybe help put a better timeline at it. At its very minimum scale, what we are looking at is data that can be useful to users. So that data presumably already exists. Either it exists in the government offices or it exists at other institutions that already compile and collate such data. And therefore, all we would need to do is to set up the warehousing arrangement whereby these data can either be inputted into our system or obtained directly from source and brought in, and provide the platform or the portal through which users could access that data. So that's at its very minimum, that's a trivial aspect of this, and I would imagine we can surely have that element up within the year without a problem. But I think we are looking at a little more than that. The data that is typically available, for example, is central bank data, national accounts data, inflation, monetary data. That is in large part the regular economic statistics. But you're looking now also at data, for example, on poverty, data on health indicators, data, for example, on climate particular factors, data on, say, soil erosion, coastal erosion, forestry. All of that is data that can inform, in the end, about our SDG goals. So assuming we could even collect those numbers, data points from various institutions that have them, we can again store those within the same way I mentioned for the economic data. But that is really transforming this into a pure post office. And I'm not really seeing us ending as a post office. I would like us to now transform that data into alternative usable outputs. And so I see room and scope for having, for example, a sustainable development goal implementation tracker, whereby we could say, given what the goals are, where the countries are, how well are they doing? I can see ways of, for example, saying, if we are to continue to meet our goals, how far are we from some benchmark, from some threshold? I can calculate what sorts of investment might be required at what cost to be able to get us to meet our particular levels of SDGs. I may even come up with an index of SDG attainment as a means of providing information or being able to hold states accountable on the SDGs. We can be looking at things like resilience. How do you measure resilience, in what dimensions? What's the necessary investments? How do we measure it in terms of the distance issues? And at the same time, maybe compile indices to get a sense of where countries are in terms of a resilience, a vulnerability type index. And I can see use of that. Maybe we can target it that countries that are least resilient should be the ones to get your most concessionary type of financing. Or we can make a plea that those that have made more progress should be given a pat on the back for having done well, and maybe we reward them by maybe getting more resources at some concessional lines. But now we are looking at how do we use that data for the benefit of the countries, both from an accountability perspective, but equally from a policy facilitating perspective. So when I talk of a data hub, I am not only thinking of the user of the data, we're also looking at the policy implications from the data, the type of information we can give to governments that they themselves can utilize that in their planning, in their budgeting, and to see where they're going and how. So the data here is more than data. It is really strengthening the capacity to entrench evidence-based decision-making in the region. It's just that I see it as being housed at CDB because it doesn't exist now, or at least not across the board. And if we could get that far, then I think it would be a tremendous support to policy making in the region and a benefit to all of our member countries.
President, another question. What kind of global financial mechanisms can be accessed or perhaps would be required now that would cater to small island developing states and their economies recovering from COVID?
Well, the recovery from COVID would mean that what was taken away from COVID is back. So at the very least, in the countries that are resource-based, then it's a matter of an additional demand for those resources, first and foremost, which means that the countries that would have been importing those resources would need to be better off, meaning their COVID situation would have improved, and therefore those countries can now start doing business again. Those that are tourism-based, what was removed are the tourists. The tourists were not coming, everything collapsed. So first and foremost, the countries that are the source of our tourists would need to be back on keel so that tourists can begin to enter, to come into the small island states. So that would be at the level of activity. The bigger issue, I think, is that the small island states already had high debt. They ended up needing to either borrow more or get deeper into debt. And the issue with small states is they are not as, quote unquote, poor as other countries much larger than them, equally developing, but even less developed than them. And so the issue of being able to get concessional funding, which means your cost of borrowing is lower, such that it is less of a burden as your debt starts to rise. Our countries don't have that benefit because in general it is benchmarked on per capita GDP or per capita income, and our per capita incomes are just too large. So in terms of mechanisms, separate from what I talked about in terms of activity, one of the global, if you want, financial architecture elements that could help reduce that impact of COVID on small states is, can they get either concessional financing, which is lower, or they get some relief on their debt service payments, or they get, even at the extreme, forgiveness of the debt so that they don't have to pay again. All those are possibilities, but these are relationships obviously between debtors and creditors. So you cannot unilaterally declare this, but it would be clearly something that one can negotiate on, or at least bring to the attention and awareness of the international community that countries have been in a very difficult space, and as a result of that, they need some assistance. Now, there have been some international support in terms of debt service payments or payments on interest, whereby the interest that was owed in 2020 and in 2021 was literally put on hold. Put on hold for at least the period of, say, 18 months. And then countries will start to pay after those 18 months with maybe 1 year's grace. But they still have to make those payments. So it deferred the payment, gave them a little room, but that debt is still there, the debt service is still there, and they have X number of years to pay that debt. We at CDB did something similar, whereby the interest payments on loans was equally, well, I want to use the word subsidized, but in principle we used funds to pay the debt service of some of our member countries from monies that we had. So we bought a little relief for them, but that doesn't impact, of course, their debt. It's just the interest that they would typically have paid that you had made some allowance on. I am told equally in the case of CDB, we did more than interest. We did both interest and principal. So that would be the type of mechanism that, that exists and can be had for small states when they run into difficulties like they did in the case of COVID. I don't know if that answers the question, but that would be some of the things we could think about.
Okay, Claire Shevchik, BVI Beacon. Please pose your question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. President. In the BVI, we had a £300 loan guarantee offered from the UK after the hurricanes of 2017 to help us recover. But government has yet to sign on to the stipulations of that loan guarantee, and some of our leaders are dismissing it as a debt trap. From where you sit, Mr. President, would you be able to speak about considerations that the BVI government or any government in a similar situation should keep in mind in deciding whether to move forward with such a guarantee?
Claire, unfortunately, you haven't given me any information to help me be determinative on to that regard. There are a number of things to take into account. What you did talk about was a guarantee. A guarantee, as I understand it, is simply to say that you are taking a loan. If you do not pay, then the person who guaranteed the loan takes on that liability to pay on your behalf. So when you mix this with it's a debt trap, I don't know what that means. Does that mean you have a lot of debt already and you can no longer add more debt to it? Or is it the case, for example, that the interest, the cost, the terms are so adverse that by going into there you will end up with a bigger problem on your hand? Or does it mean that the guarantor will not honor its liabilities when it comes to this? I really don't know enough about the BVI, but you asking me to give you an answer that and you're not helping me by telling me sufficient. So maybe you can add some more meat to it and see if I can help you out.
Yes, well, one of the major issues that government leaders have brought up is that they do feel that the stipulations in the loan guarantee are too onerous, and that it would essentially allow the UK to dictate the terms of the recovery and run the recovery projects. Does that help you at all?
Not exactly, but let's take that line a little if you want. I mean, you know, I don't know what onerous means either, but let's think for this. When you go to your bank and you say to the bank you want to borrow X amount for your car, for example, or for a student loan, the first thing the bank will tell you is how much are you earning? What are your expenses? How good and long have you held your job? Is it stable? Are you likely to lose it? And by the way, after you give me all of that information, I need some guarantee. They just don't call it a guarantee. They tell you they want collateral. And that collateral now says, give me your mortgage or your house. I will take the lien on that house. And if you don't pay me, I will forcibly eject you from your house and sell it so I can get my money back. No one ever queries that. No, it is an acceptable risk. Now, I don't know what the UK government is asking of the BVI, but it sounds to me like what is included is, I wouldn't even say a demand, but an interpretation or a fear that if they sign this guarantee, they will want to say to the BVI government, you need to do A, B, C, D, essentially to get these funds. So again, you need to say what this A, B, C, D is, what's the backdrop, what's the context, is it reasonable, not reasonable? So I'm sorry I haven't been able to help you out a lot, but you need to give me more information to be able to help you.
Actually, Mr. President, that was quite helpful, so thank you.
Oh, very good. I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you, Claire. Well, we did set aside from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. for this engagement, and we know that we'll be speaking individually with some other members of the media as we go forward, and even after we wind up this press conference. We thank you so much for your support over the years, and more particularly over the last 3 weeks with the events of our annual meeting. And we, as I said, the President has been looking forward to engaging with the media, and you can tell that there's going to be some good intellectual and academic and even fun sparring as we go forward. But there is a lot to talk about. There's a lot that we have to do. We're going to need the media's help to do it because we're all on Team Caribbean. So thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon, and the dialogue continues. Thank you.